Arles Perry was born Arlis on February 22, 1955. She was the youngest of 3 children, and her parents, Marvin and Jean Dykema, took great measures to protect their children from harm. Marvin and Jean were devout in their faith, going so far as to create the Bismarck Reformed Church, which has since changed its name to the Bismarck Community Church. Growing up, Arlis was considerably sheltered by her parents. All those who knew her would go on to describe her as overly trusting of strangers and incredibly naive. She was also described as optimistic and compassionate, with many noting that Arlis would always stop to help someone she believed was in need, even if it got in the way of her plans. Arlis and her siblings were a staple of the church, and in her free time outside of school, she was often found talking to others about her faith and trying to convert those who didn't hold her same beliefs. Those around Arlis would go so far as to say that she thought it was her mission in life to bring others closer to God in the same way, and that she was put here to save others' souls. Otherwise, Arlis's life was fairly normal. While in high school, she became a cheerleader and would regularly attend all Bismarck High School sporting events, and it was at one of these events that she would meet Bruce Perry. Bruce, like Arlis, had spent his entire life in Bismarck and was a prominent track and field star. The two quickly began dating, and according to friends and family, they were a perfect match. The couple graduated from high school in 1973 and continued their relationship into college. Bruce had been accepted to Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, while Arlis decided to stay at Bismarck and begin her secondary education at the local community college. Though the distance proved difficult for the couple, they were both committed to making their relationship go the distance. However, when Bruce returned to Bismarck after completing his freshman year, he told Arlis that their relationship was no longer working. The distance was too much for him, and that he didn't want to return to Stanford if it meant that he could not be with her, so he asked her to marry him. At the age of 19, the two wed and began their lives together in earnest. When Bruce returned to Stanford, Arlis was at his side as his wife. The pair quickly set themselves up in Palo Alto, setting up residence in Escondido Village, a residence hall on campus for married couples. Bruce was a second-year pre-med student who worked full-time, which left the 19-year-old bride with plenty of time to herself. Even when Bruce was at home and the pair would go out together, Arlis would state that she felt somewhat isolated. Bruce had established himself in Palo Alto the year that they had been apart. He had his own friends, work, and a community that he seemed comfortable in, while she felt alone. Arlis had lived an extremely sheltered life and had never been on her own before. Moving out of the state had already been extremely eye-opening for the young woman, as she had never been outside of Bismarck. She had no idea how to ingratiate herself with her surroundings, and often felt as if she were an outsider in her own home. In letters she would send to friends and family back in Bismarck, Arlis would state that she often found herself getting lonely during the day and didn't necessarily understand people in California, but she was determined to find her place in the college town. On a number of occasions, she spoke about going on long walks about the sunny campus and trying to make friends, only to have people brush her off or get angry with her. After a month or so in California, she found employment at a law firm in the area, where she worked as a receptionist. The job marked a turning point for Arlis, as she had felt she had finally had something of her own in the area. Her feelings about living in California changed from that point on in her letters. She would tell her parents that she loved California, and how she finally felt like her life was falling into place. She would relay how she enjoyed going on long, winding walks around the campus, and how she made friends with some of her coworkers, and most especially, how much she enjoyed visiting the Stanford Memorial Church. The church became a respite for Arlis, but unfortunately, it would also be the place that her life was taken. Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Today we are going to be covering the case of Arles Perry, and how her untimely death was finally solved 4 decades later. This story was one that we've been aware of for a considerable amount of time, and when our patrons suggested we cover it, my brother and I leapt at the chance. Before we go any further though, I do want to briefly address our production rate as of 2024. In 2023, we routinely put out videos every week, with small pauses every so often due to issues on the back end. However, since 2024, we've hit multiple roadblocks, including the family of one of the people we have covered deliberately targeting our channel. This means reporting our videos and trying to take our coverage down. These issues are obviously not pleasant, but compounded with some personal health issues that have come up, we've slowed down to only making 1 video a month. I realize that to most of our audience, that is simply unacceptable, and I wholeheartedly apologize. We are hoping to make more content in the coming months, and once more return to the weekly upload schedule, but I understand if this has caused a break in trust and reliability. But with all of that said, we're big, we're bad, we're back with another video, so get excited. On October 12, 1974, at 11:30 p.m., Arlis informed Bruce that she was going to go on a short walk to the mailbox in order to send out some letters to friends and family. Bruce, having been away from her all day, opted to join her, not liking the idea of her walking around by herself so late at night. However, their journey was cut short. Sometime on the walk, the pair got into a petty, inconsequential argument about the tire pressure on their car. The argument was small, with both parties telling the other that they should be the one to refill the tire, but afterwards, Arlis told Bruce that she needed some time to be by herself, and that he should go back to the dorm. When asked where she would go so late at night, Arlis told him she was just going to walk around campus and stop by the church, and she would be home soon. And so Bruce returned home. At 11:50 p.m., Arlis would enter the Stanford Memorial Church, according to the night security guard and two other witnesses. The church was meant to be closed at midnight, giving her just 10 minutes to pray. But according to the witnesses inside of the church, Arlis was still inside when they left at 12. The security guard, Stephen Crawford, would report that he didn't get around to closing and locking the church until 12:10 a.m., as he had been held up by another party. He would go on to state that he did a substandard check to see if anyone remained in the church before locking up, only popping his head into the building and glancing around to see if anyone was still there. He called out twice to anyone who could possibly still be in the church, informing them that he would be locking the building, and when he received no answer, he did so. Notably, he did not see Arlis, nor anything that appeared out of the ordinary. Stephen was meant to have walked through the church prior to locking it down, checked the bathrooms, and the rectory to make sure no one was hanging about, but he failed to do so, meaning that when he locked the doors, Arlis could have been locked inside with anyone. Arlis and Bruce were regulars at the church, and as such, Bruce was well aware that the church locked their doors at midnight. He waited patiently in the shared dorm for Arlis to return, but as time wore on, he became concerned. He tried to rationalize Arlis's absence, knowing that Arlis could have gotten stopped by another churchgoer, or perhaps still needed to walk off some of her frustration with him. But by 12:30, Bruce became so concerned, he decided to find her himself. The young husband walked to the church at 12:30, but found the building locked tight. He checked every available door and window, but all were locked. When he peered into the church, he found no signs of Arlis or anyone else for that matter. Fearing the worst, but hoping for the best, Bruce continued to search for Arlis, walking the entire Stanford campus until 3 in the morning, but still he found no signs of his wife. At which point, he returned to their home and alerted the police. Arlis was barely 4 hours missing, but Bruce insisted that she was not the kind to leave without warning. He told him exactly what had happened that night, from the pair's small argument about their car to Arlis stating that she was going to go pray for 10 minutes before the church closed. Bruce would go further to state that he believed that Arlis might still be in the church, telling the responding officers that he thought it was possible that his young wife had accidentally fallen asleep in the place of worship and had accidentally been locked in. As the police spoke to Bruce, they noticed that the young med student had a considerable amount of blood on his clothing. When asked about the blood, the young man was quick to state that he suffered frequent and severe nosebleeds whenever he was stressed, and he had been so preoccupied with finding his wife, he had barely noticed he had begun bleeding. Following his brief questioning, Bruce and the police made their way back to the church, hoping to gain access to do a proper search. But, like before, they found the building locked up tight with no signs of life present. At approximately the same time as the police becoming involved in the search, the nighttime security guard would note that he did a full sweep of the inside of the church, finding nothing out of the ordinary. He would later claim that he walked up and down the pews, checking to see if there were any signs of vandalism or anything out of place, but found no signs of life. At 5:45 a.m., that same nighttime security guard, Stephen Crawford, would begin his routine of opening the church for the day. As he walked around the outside of the building, unlocking each door, he found that one of the doors was already unlocked. Stephen would swear that he had locked the door the night prior, a statement that was confirmed by both Bruce and the police during their multiple attempts to find Arlis. Immediately, fearing that he had accidentally locked a thief in the night prior, Stephen entered the building, expecting to find that some of the holy items had been stolen or at the very least vandalized, but what he found was much worse than that. In one of the front pews, laying in the same spot she had knelt to pray in hours earlier, he found the body of Arles Perry, naked from the waist down and posed in a way that was meant to be deliberately shocking to the person who found her. She had never left the church. The jeans she had been wearing the night before had been torn from her body and left discarded on her torso, as if she were garbage. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and her legs were purposely spread open in order to further humiliate her after death. An ice pick was protruding out of the left side of her head, and the handle had been broken off and her neck had been broken. But that was not all. Arles's killer hadn't been satisfied with just murdering the young woman. Arles had been sexually assaulted with a candle that was usually housed on the altar, and the candle had been left inside of her. Another candle had also been left on her, but placed on her chest in a manner that was again meant to sexually humiliate her after death. Semen and a palm print had also been found near her body. There was no indication of a struggle, or that Arles had been alive during the majority of the assault. However, markings on her face and body indicated that she'd been beaten and strangled during the attack. The evidence indicated that Arles had been struck by the ice pick first in the attack, which would have killed her. Everything done afterwards was overkill. The sheer amount of rage and hatred that was necessary to carry out this attack was considerable. Whoever killed Arles had spent a significant amount of time doing so. They had time to look around, think of new ways to hurt the young woman, and they had likely been inside the holy building until right before Crawford had returned to unlock it at 5:45 a.m. However, the killer's rage was not entirely focused on Arles. To kill someone, anyone, in this manner is horrifying, but to do so in a holy site, one that's meant to be a haven for the downtrodden and the abused in society, using holy objects and items, that's telling. Whoever killed Arles had a lot of anger, specifically towards the church, and they wanted to hurt the church just as much as they wanted to hurt Arles. They killed Arles, but what they really wanted to kill was people's trust and belief in the church, and Stanford as a whole. One of the presiding priests had been allowed to see the body and made multiple public statements that the murder had been a satanic ritual. That sentiment gained traction with the public, with many men and women stating that Arles's murder was direct evidence of the rise in Satanism. Rumors quickly spread about the crime scene and about Arles's life in general. The public, eager to make sense of the crime, and journalists, eager to sensationalize the final moments of the young woman, began to spread unsubstantiated gossip as fact. One rumor was that Arles's legs had been bent after death, and that her body had been posed to resemble that of a pentagram, whilst another was that Arles had been trying to convert a local sect of Satanists who also followed Scientology to Christianity, and had thus made herself a target. None of these rumors are true, but many of them have since been regurgitated by some sources uncritically. In the research portion of the video, we have found at least 5 legitimate sources who have repeated these rumors as if they were true, despite the evidence to the contrary. The police did what they could to quell the rumors, but many would insist that the police's statements were false. They would go on to claim that either the police were being controlled by the Satanists themselves, or they were trying to keep the public from knowing the truth, so as not to scare them. That sentiment can be found in many discussions about the case to this day, with some believing that the case is part of a larger conspiracy. I can comfortably predict that in the comment section of this video, there will be at least 100 comments denoting the fact that we didn't address every single conspiracy that has been attached to the case, and therefore this coverage cannot be trusted. But to be clear, this is a deliberate choice on our part. The amount of theories about this case was plentiful, and many are disrespectful to Arles's memory. They were created by strangers who do not know her, who use her death as a type of fan fiction, and her family has stated numerous times that they don't appreciate that kind of speculation. While those theorizing likely mean no harm, we will only be discussing one of the larger theories regarding the case, as well as what actually happened to Arles, as both are important. So as always, we do recommend just keep the comments specific to the case details and what we know about the case. Directly after Arles's body was found, the investigators made the executive decision to not inform Bruce of her death. Instead, they took the worried 19-year-old to the police station for what they told him was standard questioning for her disappearance. For 2 hours, the police hounded the med student about his relationship with his wife. They questioned if he had walked in on Arles cheating on him that night and attacked her, or if she had told him she was pregnant and he was unhappy about it. They repeatedly implied that he knew more than he had stated, more specifically that he had hurt his wife and hidden her away. But Bruce didn't break. He loved his wife, and he repeatedly relayed what had happened that night prior to Arles's disappearance. When asked if he would undergo a polygraph examination, he willingly agreed and provided his fingerprints for testing. His prints were immediately compared to the prints that were left at the scene, and were not a match. After passing his polygraph tests, the police were sure that Bruce had no part in his wife's demise, and informed him of her death. The police then turned their sights to the only other person who could have seen Arlis prior to her death, the nighttime security guard, Stephen Crawford. Stephen's story had been that he watched Arlis enter the church at 11:50 p.m., but that she hadn't been inside when he locked the door 20 minutes later. He claimed that he only had done a cursory check of the church, sticking his head in the door and calling out to anyone inside that he would be locking up. His crime, it would seem, was sheer laziness, as the investigators believed that he had, at the very least, locked Arlis in the church with the killer. When the investigators questioned Crawford about that night, they noted that various portions of his story could not be true. Had he walked through the church at 3 a.m. the way he had claimed, he would have seen Arlis's body or encountered the murderer. However, some officers gave him the benefit of the doubt. Stephen's incompetence had gotten a young woman killed, and they figured he was simply trying to push any blame off of himself. When asked if he would take a polygraph test or give his fingerprints to check, Crawford bristled. According to the police, he seemed agitated and unwilling to help any further. Eventually, he relented and allowed himself to be fingerprinted, but after examining his palm print, the police let him go. They continued to look at Crawford as a person of interest in the case, although they had no direct evidence of any wrongdoing. Many other people were questioned in regards to the murder, including the priests at the church, but all were ruled out based on the evidence at the scene. Because of the nature of the crime and the speculation that a satanic cult was involved, the FBI was asked to look over the case details and provide a profile of the person they believed was responsible. The public hoped that the FBI profile would affirm what they believed to be true, that an entire group of Satanists were responsible for Arlis's death. But the opposite was true. The FBI profile indicated that one person was responsible for the attack, a male between the ages of 17 and 22. This man would be a loner, and likely had a military background. The profile also stated that the killer would have taken something from Arlis as a souvenir, that way he could relive the crime. This profile would later be found to be incredibly accurate. As the investigation continued, Arlis's body was returned to Bismarck to be laid to rest. However, shortly after being buried, someone stole a temporary grave marker that had been placed on her grave. When this fact was publicized, many people believed that this was another sign of a satanic cult targeting the young girl. Many people believed that whoever had killed Arlis had traveled from Palo Alto to Bismarck in order to victimize Arlis and her family, and to throw her death in their faces. However, many experts have weighed in, believing that the grave marker was stolen due to the high-profile nature of the crime and was likely taken by teenagers. As the police continued their investigation, many of the tips the police had received were deemed untruthful and unhelpful. Because of the sensationalized nature of the case, as well as the public gossip surrounding it, people wanted to be involved. People would report that their neighbors had been acting suspiciously after the murders, and that they had believed they might be a part of a cult that killed Arlis. Their reasoning was often that the neighbor wore a lot of black and would listen to aggressive music. Things like Johnny Cash or Conway Twitty. But little actual evidence. As the police sifted through these fabricated stories and debunked false tips, the case grew cold, which led to the public believing that the police weren't doing their job. Public opinion on this case was that the police were ill-equipped to take on a satanic cult, and that they were burying their heads in the sand. They felt that the cops simply didn't want to believe that there were Satanists in Palo Alto, so they were allowing the murderers to walk free, and one of these people was Mari Terry. Years after Arlis's death, a shooter began terrorizing New York City. This shooter would correspond with the police and the media, calling themselves Son of Sam. In letters he would leave at his crime scenes, or send directly to the media, the killer would state that he was a monster, that he lived in the sewers, and that he was working alongside Satan, or sometimes he would state that he was Satan. The killer was later found to be David Berkowitz, who claimed to have been ordered to kill by his neighbor's dog. After Berkowitz was sentenced for his crimes, he would change his story, claiming that he did not act alone, but as a part of a satanic cult labeled the Sons of Sam. Berkowitz claimed that he had joined a satanic cult in the spring of 1975 and had begun killing in league with them. In 1979, 5 years after Arlis's horrific murder, he would mail a book about the occult to the police in Bismarck, where Arlis grew up. Passages from the book had been underlined to indicate their importance, and Berkowitz had written Arles Perry, hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to Caliph, Stanford University. Killers like Berkowitz, ones who try to gain notoriety by speaking with the press and sowing fear, often take credit for crimes they could not have committed after they have been caught. Many murderers kill to feel some form of power and control, and when they are caught and put in prison, a place where any control is taken away from them, they try to reassert their power by claiming to have more victims, or knowing about more unsolved crimes. Oftentimes, killers use this knowledge as a sort of bargaining chip to use to get better accommodations or strike a deal with the police, but other times they simply want attention. Berkowitz would claim that the satanic cult he had joined had taken credit for Arles's death, and that he knew the person who had killed her. He sent multiple letters claiming to have pertinent details about her death, and that he could essentially lead the police to the killer. However, when questioned by the police, they determined he had little value to offer. They also found that every detail he had about the crime was publicly reported information. Psychologists and experts who examined Berkowitz would go so far as to debunk his statements about being part of a cult, stating that he was not mentally capable of being involved with such an intense group. Moreover, Berkowitz's position in this group would have been high up, given all that he stated that he knew, but that wasn't possible. In order to be as active in this fictitious cult as he claimed, he would have had to have the ability to socialize and charm others, which he was fundamentally unable to do. But many people were dissatisfied with Berkowitz's apprehension and believed more was at play. They felt as if one seemingly mentally unwell man could not have been responsible for throwing New York into terror, and many theorized that he was a scapegoat for those really responsible. Like with Arles's death, they felt as if more was at play and that the police weren't doing their jobs. So when Berkowitz eventually posited cult involvement, people became interested, namely Arles Perry. Arles Perry was a journalist who had long suspected that the Son of Sam killings were not done by one party, but rather a group of Satanists. He scoured over all available documents and records, and based on eyewitness sketches and Berkowitz's own letters, theorized that multiple men were responsible for the killings in New York, and that there was a network of satanic killers active across the United States. He would publish his theories in a book, The Ultimate Evil, and would make the rounds on every available television and radio show that would give him the time of day. Terry's book went into detail about Arles's murder, and alleged that while Berkowitz didn't kill her himself, someone in the Sons of Sam did. He alleged that the police were wrong to ignore the Satanist angle, and that Arles had been trying to convert members of the satanic killers to Christianity. He claimed that days prior to her death, Arles was seen arguing with a man at her work, and that the night of her death, she purposely provoked an argument with Bruce so she could go and see this man, who would eventually kill her. However, the reality of her death wasn't nearly as sensational. In 2016, the case was being re-examined by cold case investigators when they made an astounding new discovery. When looking over the evidence, they found that the original investigators had mislabeled some of the evidence, and the pants they had believed to belong to Arles actually belonged to Bruce. The pants she had been wearing when she was attacked had been mislabeled, and therefore unexamined. They quickly remedied this action and quickly had forensics examine the pants, and found that there was semen present. As they reran the semen against every person of interest they had interviewed, they retraced their steps, interviewing all of those who had previously been spoken with. It wouldn't be until 2018, 2 years later and 44 years after Arles's death, when they would have the name of the man who killed her, Stephen Crawford, the security guard. When the FBI provided a profile for Arles's murder, they stated that he would be a man between the ages of 17 and 22, that he would collect the victim's possessions as souvenirs, and, most notably, that he would be a loner with a military background. Stephen was a veteran of the United States Air Force when he began working at Stanford University. He worked as an on-campus police officer at the university for about a year before a new police chief was hired. This chief of police would decide to reorganize the department, resulting in many of the officers being demoted or put into new departments. This change was said to infuriate Stephen, who would spend the majority of his remaining time at Stanford incensed by this demotion. He repeatedly told friends and family that he felt disrespected by this change, and that they would regret doing this to him. He would often disparage the university, telling people that it wasn't as great as it seemed, and would take pleasure in talking poorly about the school. After Arles's death, Stephen would continue to work there for another 2 years, before ultimately leaving. However, in 1992, his ex-wife would alert the police that he had stolen between 200 and 300 books, photographs, and ancient artifacts from the campus. Stephen had stolen items from the university's libraries in the Department of Anthropology, including leather-bound Latin texts dating from the 16th century. These items were priceless and required specialized care, but Stephen did little to take care of them. When asked why he stole the items, he reportedly stated that he, quote, just liked old things, end quote. In 2016, the cold case investigation interviewed Crawford again and informed him they had found new evidence. Although they didn't tell Crawford what the new evidence was or if it had directly tied him to the case, he seemed to understand that he was about to be found out. He had never willingly given the police his DNA, but after the interview, they were able to obtain a water bottle he had discarded to test against the semen sample. Directly after this interview, Crawford would write a suicide note, although he failed to follow through with it. However, he kept the suicide note, seemingly waiting for the day his crimes would be found out. When the DNA results came back as belonging to Crawford, the Santa Clara County Sheriff detectives immediately ascertained a warrant for Crawford's arrest. The former security guard was in his 70s, and despite the brutal nature of the crime, the detectives felt confident that he would be brought in easily. That was not the case. The police knocked on Crawford's studio apartment door, and he asked them to give him a moment to get dressed. After waiting a few minutes, they entered his apartment, using the key the landlord had provided. The detectives found Crawford sitting in his bed with a gun in his hands. Due to the small space, they retreated out of the apartment for their own safety, but immediately heard a shot ring out from the apartment. The man who had brutally killed Arlis 40 years prior had killed himself in order to shirk responsibility. Following Crawford's suicide, the police searched his apartment and found the book, The Ultimate Evil, within his possession. It seemed that he enjoyed seeing his crimes written out, especially when it implicated a wider conspiracy. Sadly, Arlis's father died 3 months prior to finding out who killed his daughter. Nearly 45 years after her murder, Arlis's memory can be laid to rest, and the public knows the truth about what happened to her. If you have made it to this portion of the video, thank you for watching. If you're interested in more content like this, subscribing to our channel is the best way to see more, but you could always simply like and comment to continue to put our content onto your homepage. With all of that said, if you have a story you would like us to cover, or a case you want to see, let us know by emailing us at dreading.official@gmail.com. Have a great day, and remember to stay safe.